I'm Julie Beth Napolin. I am president of the New Schools chapter of AAUP. And, the chapter and other units on campus felt a need after the strike to come together and think about the future of the new school, not just as a place where we labor, but also as a place where we think and struggle together as a university. And Nick Mitchell, who will be speaking tonight, immediately came to mind. This discussion is presented by AAUP and sponsored by the Politics and Sociology Department as part of Beyond Austerity School, an ongoing series of events whose aim is to imagine beyond the seemingly permanent logic of austerity in the university as a set of top-down political and economic policies that perpetuate insecurity, intensify the debt burden of teaching and learning, increase workloads differentially across gender, race, and class, and discipline the democratizing potential of anti-racist, feminist, and anti-capitalist projects. Tonight, we are welcoming Nick Mitchell, who is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the founding coordinator of the Black Cultural Studies Research Cluster and the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Graduate Collective. Her research and teaching explore the social arrangements of knowledge and the ways that knowledge and its institutional practices arrange the social world. Mitchell is also a member of the Abolition University Research Cluster. I'd like to read a little passage from an essay, Abolitionist University Studies, an Invitation, which Mitchell co-wrote with the members of Abolition University. And if you haven't had a chance to look at Nick's work in critical university studies, I highly recommend reading the invitation. And in a moment, I'll put a link to it in the chat. What kinds of spaces, relationships, ways of knowing, and even institutions might an abolitionist approach to the university bring into being? To think the university through an abolitionist mode entails approaching our study of and relationship to such institutions through a combination of social critique and a willingness to struggle to think and build the impossible. We have chosen this name, a name that positions the university as the object of abolition, in an effort to short circuit the university's claims of a priori goodness as a way of making the university newly available for thinking. For us, an abolitionist approach is one which confronts the foundational epistemological and material violences of the US state, liberalism, and capitalism. Tonight, Mitchell will ask, how can we make use of the tools of minoritized fields of study to ask a question that contemporary humanities scholarship rarely does? What is a university? In this talk and workshop, Mitchell will present from Discipline and Surplus, Black Studies, Women's Studies, and the Dawn of Neoliberalism under contract with Duke UP. It is a historical study in that it uses the institutional histories of Black studies and women's studies as an optic to read the university itself. Professor Mitchell will be joined in conversation with David Baring Porter, who is Assistant Professor of Culture and Media at Eugene Lang College at the New School. His areas of research include film and media studies, new media theory, and the intersections of media, science, and technology. His current book project, Undead Labor, is a study of undead labor and the ways that race, labor, and value come together in the mediated body of the zombie. So without further ado, take it away, Nick, and then we'll be turning to David for response and conversation, and then opening it up to questions. And feel free to add questions to the stack, and I'll try to keep track of them. And yeah, all right, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie, so much. And thank you all for having me and spending your afternoons, well, it's afternoon/evening with me in California. Yeah, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all. I'm hoping to keep the tone pretty conversational. I find myself less and less drawn to writing talks, or when I start writing talks, I end up just deciding how I'm going to go off script. So I'm going to be a little bit improvisational with you all today, and just trust that we can, if you have questions, that they'll come up in the conversation. So I made some slides that I will pull up. Okay. So what is a university? A really, really difficult question, and you got to figure out how to break it up into manageable pieces. And so um, that's one of the things I'm trying to take on in my current book project, Discipline and Surplus, Black Studies, Women's Studies in the Dawn of Neoliberalism. And so this book has changed a lot. It's taken a lot of different forms. It's taken a long time. Started really working on it as my dissertation, and then kind of exploding it at a couple of different points, because I I wanted it to be alive to the concerns that were animating me and the people that I've been in conversation with at the moment. So what it is a historical study. I was trained in the History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz. So I live the crisis of people who are trained simultaneously in history and theory, of being subject to two different norms of fields and feeling completely inadequate to do either well. But existing within that crisis is, I think, a generative-ish space, if you can survive it. And so it's a historical study of the minoritized knowledges that uses that historical moment to develop a theory of the university. And at the center of that theory is the category of surplus, particularly population surpluses, labor surpluses, surpluses in governance capacity, which I can talk more about, and finance capital surpluses. If you read Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag, you will recognize the lineage of those combination of surpluses in the explanation of the foundation of an institution. For Gilmore, tracing four surpluses: surpluses in population / labor, surpluses in land, surpluses in state capacity, and surpluses in finance capital, offers a way of historicizing the massification of the prison system in the 1980s. So I'm largely borrowing that framework with some tweaks, and I think the borrowing is both because I think it's a brilliant and useful framework, but the borrowing's also because there is a historical and institutional kinship between universities and prisons in fact borrow many of those funding mechanisms once they begin expanding on a large scale in the late 70s and the early 1980s. But of course, the category of surplus has a larger history, largely articulated through and elaborated in Marxist theory. And surplus in Marx is, of course, a way of, for Marx, establishing one of the major engines of capitalist production. For Marx, surplus populations, and those are populations who are ancillary, kind of on the outside of capitalist production. Oftentimes, the category of the unemployed is the kind of most prominent modern category of surplus population. So the unemployed are necessary for capitalist production, partly because they represent ways of capitalist expansion in the future, new ways of new collectivities for incorporating labor power in the future, but also they offer ways of disciplining current laborers. With the existence of unemployed people means that capitalism can incorporate unemployed people as a way of keeping wages down and disciplining workers to either work at under conditions they would not otherwise accept. The existence of someone else who is capable of doing your job makes it so that you can lose your job, and therefore forces down wages, as well as turns basically puts laborers into competition with each other. And so the idea here is that capitalist production always requires an outside of production, and that outside points to the question of surplus. I also argue in the book that this isn't a framework that I'm imposing from the outside onto the moment that I'm looking at. And Black studies and women's studies, it's largely a study of the 1960s and 1970s. The question and the problem of surplus, I argue, is very alive to the people who are working in that moment. To Clark Kerr, who at the time is the president of the University of California, who writes that if the faculty is looking upon itself as a guild, the undergraduate students are coming to look upon themselves as a class. Some may even feel like a lumpen proletariat. Some of you who've read Marx will know that the lumpen proletariat is one of the formations of the surplus population that Marx is theorizing. But Clark Kerr is not the only person talking about the lumpen proletariat. The Black Panther Party, of course, developed its theory that the lumpen proletariat was the truly revolutionary class, to the extent, and the idea of the lumpen proletariat was so common within the Panther everyday parlance that when they formed a funk band in their Oakland chapter, the funk band actually called themselves the Lumpen. And so this just to underscore the idea of a surplus population is something that activists in the 60s were dealing with in one form or another in many, many different ways. Some of you have read Mario Savio's famous speech from the free speech movement, in which he's kind of puzzling over what a student is in relation to a university and trying to figure out like what if the university is this kind of mechanism that sees itself as a business, what is the student's relationship to it? Well, the student's not a worker. The faculty is technically workers within this epistemological schema. So how do students actually fit into the machine that is the university? That crisis of being both central and outside to the institution is the question of being surplus in the institution, and making sense of what the nature of that surplus formation is part of the work that the book is attempting to do. So what I want to do today is give you a little bit of of the historical formation that leads into the moment of the 60s. I want to start with the GI Bill and talk about how the GI Bill actually gave the university an infrastructural basis for the absorption of surplus populations specifically, but also land surpluses as well, and then talk about why that formation is relevant to the emergence of Black studies and women's studies. I'll also close with some questions about how that relates to questions of austerity. But my preview is as far as austerity goes, to the extent that privatization is one of the major categories that we're thinking through in austerity, then privatization always indexes a prior moment of accumulation. some of the most alive examples for folks when I was in college were the examples of water privatization in Latin America through structural adjustment policies. Privatization of public utilities can only happen when the public utility has, in a prior moment, functioned to accumulate all of these resources and distribute them en masse in such a way that people's lives have begun to revolve around those resources. So privatization is, like, to kind of put it too schematically, kind of a massive bait and switch campaign. So the production of these institutions that absorb masses of people, absorb masses of resources that societies begin to organize themselves around, those in the schema of austerity are the first step in a larger dance that involves privatization. So figuring out the moment of accumulation, the moment of accumulation of surpluses is a really important moment to figure out, okay, then what's the accumulation process that's being privatized as well. So I want to look to the GI Bill to start that story. So the GI Bill, as I frame it in the book, produces en masse the student as a solution to post-war surpluses. And so the GI Bill, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, was an aggressive effort to plan for the demobilization of 15 million veterans from the Second World War. It did so in a context in which the U.S. was planning, or in which the U.S. already saw itself as winning the war, and wanted to offer to veterans a package of benefits that would express the country's gratitude. But it was also a way of responding to previous moments of veterans benefits that had not gone as well as to utilize education to do some of the work to avoid some of the outcomes of the First World War. As many of you know, one of the outcomes of the First World War, most immediately, massive inflation, labor uprisings, race riots, the Red Summer of 1919. So massive anti-Black race riots from white soldiers who were reintegrating into their communities, and finding that in some of their communities, Black migrants had taken many jobs. And so those moments are on U.S. officialdom's minds, especially because the idea that the U.S. was overcoming its racial history was a major feature of being able to anticipate the Cold War and anticipate geopolitical strategy in the context of the Cold War. So the GI Bill had to anticipate all these returning veterans who would be looking for jobs, and who would become a public policy problem if they didn't find jobs, and the way that the unemployment problems became problems of racialized violence as well. On top of that, another major mechanism was that they just fought a war in which veterans had become a major force in Nazification in Germany. And so the idea of veterans becoming a counter-governmental force, a force that it could be organized against established power, was especially important. So the idea of giving benefits to express being a grateful nation really was in a large part a managerial operation. The U.S. Senate Finance Committee said that only the U.S. and Great Britain were the countries that didn't fail in reintegrating the civilian population. So to avoid disaster and chaos, it was important to develop a major flight of veterans benefits. Education became somewhat unexpectedly a major way of doing that, but there wasn't consensus on the idea that bringing veterans into higher education was a good idea. There is a fantastic article, a highly enjoyable weird article by the University of Chicago president Robert Maynard Hutchins called "The Threat to American Education," in which that really lays bare the question of surplus population as it's playing out over debates on the GI Bill. So what Hutchins says is he argues that education should not be used as a substitute for the dole or a program of national or public works. Education institutions, as the big-time football racket shows, cannot resist money. The GI Bill of Rights gives them a chance to get more money than they have ever dreamed of, and to do so in the name of patriotism. They will not want to keep out unqualified veterans. They will not want to expel those who fail. Even if they should want to, they will not be allowed to, for the public and veterans organizations will not stand for it. Colleges and universities will find themselves converted into educational hobo jungles, and veterans unable to get work and equally unable to resist putting pressure on the colleges and universities will find themselves educational hobos. So the fear of lumpen proletarianization of veterans, that veterans will become a transient class of either unemployed people or people who are reliant on social benefits, looms over this discourse. And Hutchins represents the kind of extreme-ish right-wing version of it. But one of the counters to this that develops in U.S. public discourse is what I call manpower discourse. And manpower basically positions surplus populations as a national resource that could be potentially squandered. And if they were squandered, then it would represent a net loss for the country. So it in some ways introduced the veteran as someone who was already disciplined, someone who was already a benefit, who had demonstrated themselves to be a benefit to their country, and who needed to be channeled into the right place in order to not be lost. And so it framed veterans benefits as something that actually engaged the opportunity costs of not misallocating veteran resources. It also operated through the increasing confidence that more people in the US population were qualified for higher education than actually went at the same time. And so this kind of manpower discourse was at the center of the ideology that generated the GI Bill. The GI Bill, I think, is probably the signature piece of public policy that defines U.S. military Keynesianism, the form of Keynesianism that connects the welfare state in its U.S. emphases with the U.S. warfare state. And so one way of thinking about the GI Bill in this regard is as a military Keynesian strategy to build up U.S. capacities for knowledge architecture, build up U.S. universities in their relationships in their ability to prop up U.S. demands for various materials for defense, but not doing so through direct monies contributed to U.S. universities. Instead, it funneled those or routed that money through veterans. And so it took the form of these transfers to U.S. universities of a larger effort that utilized the mass production of students as a labor force contraction mechanism. What does that mean? It means that when economists calculate the labor force, and the labor force is the calculation that's used to figure out how many people are unemployed, what the unemployment rate is. People who are not looking for a job are not included in the labor force. So students, people who are students are not who are full-time students or who are part-time students and then part-time employed. Either they're like involved in the labor force as part-timers, or they're not involved at all within labor force calculations. And so the category of the student actually disappears a large portion of the population that would otherwise be included in the unemployment rate. Why does this matter? Well, it really matters in the context of the emerging Cold War, when the US is trying to argue that capitalism doesn't structurally produce unemployment. The disappearance of millions of people who would otherwise be included in the labor force, but there are not jobs for, means that the unemployment rate actually gets suppressed because we have a means of mass producing students. So the fact that by the 1950, there's a little over 1 million people in US colleges and universities. In 1960, there's 3.5 million people in US colleges and universities. In 1970, there's 8 million people in US colleges and universities. And then by 1980, there's 12.5 million people in US colleges and universities. If you just dumped all of those people onto the unemployment rates, the unemployment tendencies of capitalism structurally would actually be pretty laid bare. So the category of the student does some incredible work to disappear what capitalism does and what capitalism does, and in a really important ideological way, because students imagine themselves, or are disciplined to imagine themselves, as people who are producing selves, improved selves for the labor market. So you don't think of like, okay, I'm a student, I am paying tuition, as I am actually paying an institution so that I can work, so that I can get a job in the future, so that my future employer doesn't have to pay to train me. I don't work through the idea that I, by going to university, am lowering the cost of employing me for future workers by not only laboring unwaged, but by paying to labor unwaged. And so the student has this massive structural and ideological function to the overall architecture of post-war capitalism in this way. But the GI Bill adds a wrinkle to this. It adds a wrinkle to this because it not only pays for veterans' tuition, their school supplies, and oftentimes their relocation costs in full, but it also gives to veterans a monthly stipend. And a monthly stipend of $50. It's initially $50 for veterans who are single, $75 for veterans who have families. It actually gets increased once the federal government realizes how many veterans are using the GI Bill benefits to use public higher education. They actually want to increase the likelihood that veterans are going to use it. So they increase the stipend within the first year of the GI Bill. So I frame this as one of the largest wages for students campaigns in US history. It doesn't take the form of that because it's organized through veterans benefits. But what veterans are receiving there is a wage for being students. That memory of the GI Bill, that framing of the GI Bill and what made it successful, actually is very quickly forgotten. And it's intended to be forgotten because the GI Bill is structured so that benefits will almost immediately terminate within the next decade. That in future US wars, a new GI Bill will have to be negotiated for veterans, and the possibility of this level of veterans benefits is not guaranteed for veterans in the future. So while the GI Bill is framed as the GI Bill of Rights, that this is not a transcendent Bill of Rights. It's going to be renegotiated with every major US military campaign in the future. So in this regard, the student becomes a major solution to the problem of post-war surplus. But it shifts, the student as a category shifts over the decade of the 1950s. Manpower discourse becomes more widely distributed throughout US society in the 1950s and the 1960s, partly because of the massive transformation in gender discourses over the context of the Second World War. Not only is the nation thinking about how to use men in the most optimal ways, but massive social planning goes into planning about how to use women in the most advantageous possible ways for both future outbreaks of war, but to think the nation's women as a population that needs to be trained in its function as a surplus population. And women are positioned as a surplus population in normative discourses in a really important way, and this has been extensively theorized by Marxist feminists, how unwaged labor by women is a central function in the reproduction of capitalist labor relations. And so this begins to be systematically appreciated by US officialdom in the 1950s, who are noting the increasing tendency of women to go to college, who are noting the fact that US education systems from K to 12 require an ongoing supply of teachers, and understanding that the transition between women's lives in in wage labor and unwaged labor needs to be more broadly planned. So you get instances like this text, Women Power, from the National Manpower Council from 1957, which unfolds alongside a whole bunch of other social institutions, Black women's clubs, labor unions, and other organizations that have something to say and a stake in the question of how women's social role is being organized between waged and unwaged labor as well. And simultaneously, manpower discourse gets applied in a particular way to the US Black population. As Andrew Hartman argues, national leaders concluded that segregation wasted the potential utility of Black children in inefficient policy akin to squandering mineral wealth or other natural resources. This is the manpower discourse at work, that the problem with racism is not that it's wrong. The problem with racism is that the nation is losing losing a resource that could be otherwise utilized. So a refashioning of the biopolitical value of Black people in such a way that allows allows the country to develop policies that are anti-racist on that basis. And this, of course, squared with a larger geopolitical agenda. As I said before, the effort to represent the US as anti-racist had major implications for its Cold War policy. And so the US officialdom took notice when 85% of the educated elite in Asian and African countries described themselves as being aware of US racial incidents. That figure was 91% in Latin America and Western Europe. And so what was framed as a manpower problem was also a major geopolitical problem as well. And so if the GI Bill created a generation of people who, largely men, who went to university, received wages, moved into the middle class, changed their social status, and increasingly inhabited the professions, at the same time as the US social landscape, sorry, I live right by a hospital, at the same time as the US social landscape was increasingly suburbanizing, was increasingly divesting from cities, was increasingly organized through highways, single family homes, and individual vehicles in order to reorganize the society. All of this was happening at the same time as the beneficiaries of the GI Bill were having children. This is the time of the baby boom. And so as a generation who really highly valued college was having children at record numbers, they expected increasingly that their children would also be going to college. And so you have a second wave of surplus, of university surplus discourse that emerges really toward the late 1950s in anticipation of the children of the baby boom. In California newspapers, you often see this take the form of people of anxieties around the fact that there are twice as many students in second grade as there are in 12th grade because of the baby boom. They are worried, like, what is going to happen with these children once they graduate high school? And so California begins a major systematic program of planning for the children of the beneficiaries of the GI Bill. Of course, the state to which the most people who received GI Bill benefits migrated was the state of California. So California is really a major case study in surplus absorption at this time as well. And as California does so, it is building up its university system in several different directions. And it starts to build up several different campuses. So I think two of the prototypical campuses of this expansion moment are the University of California, Irvine, and the University of California, Santa Cruz. UC Irvine is an excellent example because it really illustrates the intersection of different surpluses. Irvine, the land that becomes UC Irvine, is owned by the Irvine Corporation. It's agricultural land until the early 1950s, when the Irvine Corporation realizes that there's a lot more money to be made from moving from agriculture to real estate in Orange County. So in Orange County, it effectively offers to the University of California system a whole swath of land at the purchase price of $1 to start the UC Irvine campus, and then begins one of the first centrally planned suburban communities around the emerging university system, which promises that it's all going to have a constantly replenishing supply of student labor to work in the suburban Irvine town. In UC Santa Cruz, what was formerly a limestone mine, and then ranch land for cows, became the UC Santa Cruz campus, which was gifted to the University of California by the Cowell family, which also had extensive real estate holdings in Santa Cruz. And in order to sell local property owners on the idea of having a university in their quiet beach town, the Santa Cruz Sentinel oftentimes just expressed to landowners what the benefits of having a constant inflow of student population would be for their property values. And so the expectation of a student became an accumulation strategy for the increasing values of real estate. So I've just I want to express like these kind of classified ads that I've pulled from. They're in every single issue of these newspapers, basically from like 1961 until 1965. Every single day, there are ads saying, "Don't miss out on the investment opportunity based on the soon-to-be arriving University of California institution." So when we talk today, when our graduate students at UC Santa Cruz are dealing with the fact that the median price for a one bedroom in Santa Cruz is $2,800 a month, what we see is that process was already foretold. That accumulation process was already foretold in before there was even a UC Santa Cruz campus. Before there was a single student on the UC Santa Cruz campus, there was actually this accumulation process that was playing out in an ancillary forum alongside students. And so in this context, the student becomes a massive accumulation strategy. And when you're thinking about the increase in population from 3.5 million in 1960 to 8 million in 1970, this absorption of surplus populations in the form of students is a major driver of what's going on there. So like one provisional answer to the question of what a university is a university is a social institution in which the majority of the work produced is by workers who receive no wages in order to work, and conversely are expected to pay in order to work. I bring this up just because I think it's a definition of the student that uses the word work over and over again. In the recent spate of strikes against universities by student unions, by graduate student unions, by faculty unions, one of the regular devices that's being mobilized by institutions is one in which faculty and students are being used almost in this like weird tautology. To be a teacher is to have students. To be a student is to be taught by people. And if there's any unbinding of that relationship, there is crisis. And if you are not showing up to teach students, then you are failing in your function as a faculty member, in the same way that if a student doesn't come to class, then they are going to fail as well. This almost inherently puts student and teacher into an antagonistic relationship that's also reframed as a relationship of care. So using work to define the student also redefines the student in such a way that what the student does and what the teacher does is actually in common. Student does something, it's work. Faculty does something, it's work. So what students and faculty do is work. That the student has to pay to do it is a problem, but actually reframing it as work makes it so that relationship is not one in which the student is paying for a commodity. Rather, what the student is paying in order to work. So I think reframed in this way, what happens in a university, I think comes out more powerfully. And just to give you an example of why this framing matters within the context of my book project, I'd point to the San Francisco State student strike. Now, the San Francisco State student strike occurred from November 1968 to March 1969. It was until relatively recent the longest student strike in U.S. history. It successfully resulted in the formation of the first college of ethnic studies in the country, and that's what it's known for. But I think one of the lesser known and lesser understood histories of the San Francisco State student strike really puts into relief one of the major things that were at stake in the demands of students. When students were asking for instance, this is demand, which is it's demand number. Might not even be on this one. Well, in the initial demands, the Black Students Union was asking for 20 faculty positions, 20 full-time faculty positions. And the Third World Liberation Front was asking for 50 professorial positions in the College of Ethnic Studies. These students had been teaching ethnic studies classes for years. The students were already doing the teaching. They'd been doing teaching initially through the experimental college. And they had found ways through the taking over the Associated Students, which is basically the large student union organization that funds all the student organizations, to pay themselves for the work that they were doing. So when they're demanding 20 professorships and 50 professorships respectfully, what they're actually demanding is to be paid for the work that they're already doing. as students. And so one of the things and the administration at San Francisco State actually understood this very well in their response to the strike, because one of the most consequential things that they did, this is in January of the strike. The strike again began in November, ended in March. In January of the strike, S.I. Hayakawa, who was the president of San Francisco State College at the time, cut off funding, froze the funds of the associated students. So he understood that one of the most effective ways of slowing momentum for the strike was slowing the capacity that the students were utilizing in order to funnel wages for themselves for the work that they were doing as students. It meant that students didn't have to have part-time jobs as students. It meant they could be full-time students and that they could organize on campus full-time. And so being paid for student work just reveals the extent to which what we are thinking of as a strike for knowledge is actually, in effect, for students who are living it, a strike for wages. This kind of really re-emphasizes the extent to which the unwaged character of the mass production of students is central to the emergence of the modern university as such. And this is happening, of course, in a majority working class student population is an important element to this story as well. I think I'll stop there because I think I've given a lot, and it's probably good to just talk some of it through. But yeah, thank you for thinking with me right now.
Oh my goodness. My head is exploding right now. I don't, oh my God. Nick, you just kind of like rewrote every narrative that we've been given about the university. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Whew.
It's kind of fun. It's kind of fun. I mean, like, I think that one of the exciting things about this work, and it's work that's been like, I've been doing this work because I've been doing it alongside people who have been fighting against the university. It began in the anti-austerity struggles in the University of California. So these ideas have just been ways of kind of sitting with the problems that have come up in the context of struggle.
Yeah, and you can really feel that with the way that you delivered this talk as well, that it just comes from that struggle, as you say. Ah, thank you so much. David, I think I'll turn it over to you for an initial set of remarks or responses.
Sure. Yeah, well, again, I just want to say, Nick, thank you so much for what has just been an incredibly sort of rich set of ideas around this. And, I think that one of the things that I think I enjoyed most about this and think is the most important and timely is the way that you're connecting sort of the university discourse to these larger discourses of population, of the sort of military industrial complex, of the boom of the real estate markets, of things like that. And I think that, the reason why I would especially like to underscore that is that it very often seems as though the discourses around the critiques of higher education somehow stop at the border of the university, and they don't actually start to extend out into realizing the university is part of a larger sort of political and economic system. And you see this sort of understandably and necessarily when sort of students who are kind of surrounded very literally and physically, right, by the university, want to kind of demand better for what's going on, and faculty who want to demand better for what's going on, and staff who want to demand better for what's going on. But often it leaves out the possibility of how you can actually start to think more broadly about how to fix these opportunities when we don't actually consider, again, these larger systems in which the university is inside, right? And I think that, this idea of surplus population that you're working with is just really brilliant and really compelling. And so, I wanted to maybe get some more of your thoughts on that, but I have a couple of really pointed moments that I would love to hear more about. For one thing that, I'm kind of coming at this from the end of your discussion rather than the beginning of your discussion. When I'm thinking about this in relation to austerity, right? And sort of the weirdnesses that we all are sort of in the middle of, those of us who are in higher education, having to sort of deal with this discourse of austerity, and how this seems to reflect what Mark Fisher's described as sort of like bipolar capitalism, right? Where it's sort of like capitalism in its sort of manic phase can't imagine anything but sort of limitless growth and sort of endless sort of explosive potential, but then is completely cannot possibly sort of deal with the actual sort of physical limitations of that, right? So it's like, of course we live in a physical world, we can't have limitless growth, right? And so instead, right, we enter into these recessions in which then, you know, as you're kind of gesturing with this problem of the university, the onus of responsibility for that is then placed on sort of the most vulnerable people in that system, right? So, you know, you have cuts of staff members, you have sort of non-tenuring of faculty members, and you have sort of the raise of tuition on students, right? Increasing sort of demand that they pay more for the same things that they're doing. Which seems maybe especially egregious given the kind of framework that you're laying out, which they're having to pay more to do work for the university, right? Which, yeah, is sort of like, you know, insane making when you think about it. So I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we start to maybe think about how to push back against these austerity measures that are taking place in the university, given, I think, this incredibly useful framework that you have just kind of laid out for us, right? Well, maybe I can start there. I mean, I have a million one questions for this. So, but
I mean, I think we're already seeing like the efforts unfold because it's unsustainable. I think that the fact that we've seen all of these graduate student strikes from the University of California to the University of Michigan, to you all, to Rutgers, and Temple. This is all happening in the past year. And so like it's like the unsustainable nature of it all is it's already here. It's already arrived. And the fact that it's almost surprising that it didn't happen earlier, considering how much I think, you know, my generation, we got told go into college, debt finance everything. That like just take on more debt, it'll pay off in your future career. And I think that like prior to 2008, that was a story that could be received by some people plausibly. I don't think it's a story that can be received in that way in the wake of that recession. And so I think that the collectivization is really important. I think that the efforts to organize industrially, even as difficult and messy as it's going to be, are especially important. Like I think understanding the university as an industry in which the people who work in it and the people who are impacted by it are going to be placed into competition with each other, means that there's a real horizon in building larger industrial unions, not just within one trade or another, but university employees. I mean, in almost every state in the US, the university is the biggest employer. And most of those employers, or most of the people employed by the university, have nothing to do with instructional labor. Unless you consider students as as people employed by the university, even if they don't work for the university formally, once that happens, then like the question of who is employed by the university becomes really, really, really thorny. And so I think building organizing strategies by sector and also by industry is one way of doing it. I think it's going to be messy. On the faculty end, like I think those of us who are like tenure stream faculty really need to figure out how to organize our colleagues, because the ideology into which all of us were inculcated, really all of us were inculcated in graduate school, is highly individualizing, highly paternalistic, incredibly difficult to be organized by. Like teaching faculty to be organizable in the first place is it's in some ways a full-time job, but I think the work for doing that has to begin before large labor actions. Like I think it needs to build its basis in everyday struggle. And I think that the authority that faculty enjoy over their students actually needs to come into question over that. I mean, I think oftentimes that authority comes with the idea that like we know what's best for our students, but I think our students interests often diverge diametrically from ours, and figuring out how to be in contact with your students and to be organized by your students is a skill. It's not a virtue, it's a skill. And it means like it's a large project of figuring out how to be organized and be organizable by the university. So I think that just like decentering in some ways, and this is what I've done, like this is what I've been trying to do, is decenter the knowledge project as the heart of the university. So the knowledge project at the heart of the university is always going to have faculty as the elite, and rethinking what the university is as an institution in solidaristic principles. I think that's like, it's a hell of a first step, but I think it's a first step that like in contesting the austerity regime, because so much of the way the institution is organized is upside down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's great. And I mean, I like the way that, the way that you answered that kind of brings together, on the one hand, the sort of actual kind of on the ground actions of, these labor unions and kind of unionization efforts that are taking place at the university, which I think are absolutely essential, right? But I mean, I do think that we also need to do some work to kind of reimagine what the university is for and what it's doing. And again, I mean, this comes back to, this really mind-blowing thing that you said earlier, which is to think about like how many, if we recategorize students as sort of like unemployed laborers in society, like what would that look like? And I just, happen to have the statistic in my head of, in 2020, it was something like 19.5 million people,
yeah,
right, were like students. So I mean, that's an astonishing like indictment, right, of a kind of economic and political system, right, that basically needs to keep these bodies, right, these people, these subjectivities in reserve, right, so that they can sort of do something later, or they can kind of be in this position of being kind of at the ready to be deployed in one place or another. And I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we start to undo that kind of thinking, right? Which, I mean, I'm not sure it's even a fair question to ask you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, like, I think that it's really important, because again, I think that it's a slightly different question than simply saying we need to decenter knowledge in the university, or it's a slightly different question than saying that we need to, organize in terms of labor unions. Like, this is in some ways a conceptual problem that again extends way outside of what the university is doing, right?
Totally. And I think that's a really important point. The question of what the university is for is like also the question of like, why the hell are we here in the first place? Like why? And I think that there's this dual nature, because I think people come to universities for reasons, like, and oftentimes in like taking refuge from other social forces. Why would it's not like our students have been tricked. Like, why would they come to the university in the first place? Why would they pay in order to work? Well, it's partly because the university it functions in some way as a refuge where you can do other work, where you can foster other kinds of connections, in a way that is so inefficient that it can't be valued by the labor system that we exist in, and that's part of why it's valuable to be in a university. It's part of what makes a university possible. It continues to have normalize structural mechanisms for the use of time in non-instrumental ways, and that lives. That's part of the living tradition and value of the institution that I think we need to really hold on to. Like I wouldn't want to call everything that happens in the university work if the absorption of it into work is just to turn it into the more instrumentalization of time. And so holding on to as much as possible of what is actually valuable in the university, I think is really important. Like one of the arguments that I make about Black studies and women's studies is that, like, when you build curricular transformation, you are building sites where people can use time together that didn't exist elsewhere. And that's part of what the value of a classroom can do. And like that if it's only like repurposed for instrumental values, I think it's not worth it. I think the part of, like, you know, my vision of communism is that it's a lot of free time. And it's an effort to liberate time. And I think that there is something about that horizon that universities offer in a radically unequal way, because most of my students are still working 2 jobs as well. And so in a radically unequal way, but it's still there, and it's still there in some really significant ways.
I think that is a really fantastic answer to that question. And I mean, I also think that it really strikes me as being such an important point that when I think about what my students love about being in school, right? Like it's not that, you know, they're having knowledge poured into their brain, right? Like some kind of baby bird, right? Like it's not that they are, you know, able to do this. It's like the social connections. It's having time to like make art or think about things without the pressure of having to be constantly productive while doing it, right? Or the idea that that becomes a kind of productivity, which, as you're pointing out, is absolutely unquantifiable, right, in some way. And I do think that, you know, as you're pointing out, there's something in the university that's, I think, incredibly valuable there. Although we're in this moment, right? And, you know, as your work kind of gestures, this is not a new moment, but we're in maybe a particularly acute moment right now, where I think that's really called into question, because there is this demand, right, that students do kind of double duty, right, as working as a university student, right, as a student, as you're saying, but also working all these other jobs that they have to work in order to survive in places like Santa Cruz or New York, right, or places where the university system seems to be working. You know, an old mentor of mine used to say that universities existed so that incredibly smart and angry people would be sort of stuck doing something else other than just being like loose in the world. And I actually think there's some kind of truth to that as well, right? Like there's a kind of social function to people being able to gather in these spaces and have the kinds of connections that can happen spontaneously in a university that is valuable. So I mean, I guess the question is like, how do we keep that but like lose the brutal exploitation that seems to be happening to students, to faculty, to staff, right? And I'm thinking especially of part-time faculty, of contingent labor forces on universities, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew, but I think that part of it is like maintaining the willingness to ask for stuff that's outrageous. Because like a wages for students campaign that also is a demand for free time will be perceived as just absolutely outrageous, unthinkable. But it's actually part of what I'm arguing about with the GI Bill is like it already happened. And it actually produced a generation of white dudes who did some pretty amazing stuff. And so like I think just asking for the stuff that they got for everyone it's not it's not without historical precedent, and I think it would be incredibly meaningful in its outrageousness.
Well, I think that is a fantastic answer, and I think that's the perfect opportunity to maybe open this up to a broader conversation. I mean, I certainly have plenty more questions that I can ask, but we have a nice group of people here, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see, I'll just take stack here. First is Jeremy, and then Kaya, and then Emma. I'll write the stack in the chat.
Yeah, this is Jeremy. Can you hear me?
I can.
Very good. I mean, I appreciated this a ton. I'm a scholar of the 60s, and I've done a fair amount of work on the post-war university. And I had never really thought of the, depleting unemployment dimension of the GI Bill. I always thought of it as upward social mobility and serving the manpower needs of the Cold War, where you need technical, bureaucratic, and administrative knowledge. And then this US state was very clear that those made of bronze would fight wars, and the middle classes and the upper middle classes would fulfill the scientific administrative mission of being, a superpower. I mean, in what you're saying, like there's this sort of devilish tension that we're all talking about, where we want to preserve the university as a kind of extended adolescence in a benign sense, a place to create, explore community, grow existentially, learn critical tools to fit you for a kind of activist citizenship. And yet in this economy especially, there's tremendous pressure that the education is instrumentalized and has some vocational value. And then those things have long been at cross purposes. And it feels like it's becoming more and more unsustainably so. And then our students already treat their education like a commodity, and in part do less work and hand in fewer of their papers because they're like, I'm paying for this, I get to decide how I use it. This isn't a system of extended evaluation of my performance. This is about me using this expensive object to maximize my future on terms that, I set. And then I just wonder, in your sort of broad vision, is it expanding access by supporting policies like free tuition in community college or the state system? Is it sort of yoking the sense of mission back to the humanism that we all know and love, and in some sense de-instrumentalizing the purpose of a degree? And then how does all this work in a society of at least perceived scarcity, and when so many people on the right say universities are simply factories of indoctrination and we need to return to manly vocational labor and not reproduce the neoliberal, liberal, professional managerial class? So that's a big swath of possibilities, but my head was spinning from your excellent talk, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have, again, I don't know. I have some like general ideas, but I think that I don't have a singular imaginary of how things look. I think that in some ways, I've read Paul Ryder and Chad Wellman's book, Permanent Crisis, which is about this idea of like non-instrumental knowledge, of humanistic knowledge, is just kind of like its crisis-bound nature goes back to the beginning of the German university in the 18th century, and for various reasons. I think that the scale of our university system today means that the effort to foster entitlement to non-instrumentalized time means something different. And the fact that so many people are pushed and pulled into universities by various economic forces, especially like the fact that our society doesn't have a lot to do for a lot of people. That feels meaningful, especially in the realm of work, and that is a real thing that universities can speak to, and also like the crises that emanate from that problem. People in universities need to organize because it's already organizing our lives in a very, very profound way. And so I think that part of what I'm thinking is less about striving towards some idealized form, because I think that those forms emanate out of collectivities that we don't maybe even have yet. But I do think that recognizing the problematic that is organizing our worlds in such a way that there are already existing possibilities, and to put it in like opportunity cost framing, there's a lot we lose if we don't. So figuring out ways to organize within that conundrum, I think, is really, really important. But yeah, like I don't like, for instance, when students don't want to do what we assign them to do, how do we make sense of what that is a symptom of? And part of it's the commodification of education, part of it's them refusing us. And I think that like students refusing us is good in a lot of ways. Like I'm trying not to be a dad, but I'm like I am positioned institutionally as dad. So yeah, like like resistance against the father function it's a good part of universities. I think that like enticing students to organize against that, as figure ways of getting organized against that, also is some of the ways we can exist within that function in negotiation with it as well. So no big program, but I think an injunction to be honest with the forces that are making us in the moment.
Thank you so much, Nick. Next in stack is Kaya, and then Emma.
Hello, how are you? I just wanted to ask, so this is all sort of new to me, this entire concept of students being sort of a unpaid labor group. And I'm entirely fascinated by this idea now and kind of obsessed. And I just wanted to ask, how does this work sort of at an intersection? I was wondering, I had an original question, but I've kind of tweaked it. I'm wondering, how does this work at the intersection of Blackness and being a student, right? Because you're then in two minority groups. So how do you then advocate for yourself as a unpaid labor group when you also have to advocate for yourself as a Black student? And how do you in turn, part two, sorry, how do you in turn advocate for yourself as somebody who is a part of a group that is literally an unpaid workforce?
Yeah, I think Black folks in universities have a particular set of things to gain and things to think through vis-a-vis these questions, especially because Black folks are in higher education in higher proportion to their numbers in the population, like much significantly higher numbers in proportion to the population, and that means that and like that fact is one that universities rely heavily on in order to offer the idea that they are legitimate institutions. They put us on display in order to sell themselves, whether it's the justice or the diversity, equity and inclusion mission, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think reframing being a student as labor actually puts more pressure on what universities do through us and on the very forces that push us to become students in the first place. One of the things I argue in the book is that the spate of urban rebellions that started in the early to mid 1960s actually pushed U.S. officials into major campaigns that started educational opportunity programs that basically tried to recruit and retain low-income Black students as a way of trying to interrupt the forces of politicization that they saw as potentially organizing against the U.S., the same forces that fed into the formation of the Black Panther Party. And so because of that, the expectation or the pull of Black folks into doing labor within universities really relied on this idea of upward mobility, on the promise of upward mobility. But I think that is not in any way a guarantee now. And I think that most of the economists who are thinking through education are thinking that it is something that staves off downward mobility now, rather than something that creates upward mobility. And I think that reframing is like, it's putting Black folks into colleges in order to just survive the overall downward pressure of our political and economic system. So that reframing, I think, puts the demand that Black people work wagelessly in institutions in order to survive in a particular context. And I think that we should definitely exploit the more moral valence available to the history of unwaged labor that actually comes into clear vision through what we do in universities as well. So I think that again, no program, but I think it's an important question and an important intersection of historical problematics.
Thank you so much, Emma.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I don't know if I have so much a question, but I think sort of something I've been grappling with a little bit that I think has come up in a few of these conversations. And to put it perhaps crudely, it's the distinction between work and labor. And on the one hand, right, in fights for unionization, faculties, graduate students, undergraduate students, right, we need to construe ourselves as labor in ways that I certainly support. And yet, on the other hand, it seems that requires a kind of reconfiguration of all the intangibles, the ephemeral nature of all of what we do, in ways that I also understand probably people in this room and you yourself to be committed to. So I'm a little bit grappling with that. And then also, by the same token, right, like universities increasingly saying you are simply labor, right, and not to denigrate labor as a category, but they themselves are kind of trafficking in a language of exchangeability, right? That's the premise of so much of the violence surrounding union breaking, among other things. So I'm just trying to sort of think through, or with the group, like wanting to think through how we consider this relationship that has always been misdiagnosed as a kind of binary, right? Work and labor, or labor as one thing and work and like the kind of intangibles as being somewhere else, while in practice acknowledging that like these are the options that we're basically being offered, you know, and how we organize or think about organizing. So that's one piece. And then the second question I have is a little bit different, but it's a little bit about the specificity of California. Right? Like, I find it so kind of fascinating, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore being kind of someone that clearly is like your main interlocutor, and you yourself, and then like people like Mike Day. Like, California is often both positioned as a test case, as an anomaly, and yet as harbinger, emblematic, you know, democratic state. Like, so I'm just kind of interested in how you understand that piece, because I do feel like the people that are thinking most incisively and historically have been about capitalism in the United States are coming from California, which is which is, I mean, by many metrics, exceptional. So yeah, anyways.
Yeah.
Feel free to
that weird straddling of like exceptional and exemplary, that is like California. I'll start with your first question. I think that one of the frameworks, the most useful frameworks I know for thinking through it, comes from, I think it's now out of print, Clyde Barrow's Universities in the Capitalist State, which is just a phenomenal book about the kind of Gilded Age through the progressive era formation of universities vis-a-vis the idea of labor. And one of the things that Barrow shows in that book is because the book toward the end kind of moves toward chronicling the formation of the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, and talks about how that formation really required framing professorial labor as exceptional. Exceptional labor. If you look at John Dewey's kind of initial formations of the idea of academic freedom, one of the arguments that he makes is like professors are akin to they operate in the public trust. That's why they need academic freedom. You also need to not lose them to industry because universities can't pay them as much as other industries can. So they need to be able to provide something that those industries can't provide. But as a result, he analogizes university professors to Supreme Court justices, and says that's the reason that we have tenure. So tenure, instead of a form of job security, which might put us in line with other people who are working, becomes a distinguishing factor that is about enforcing this idea of academic labor that is at its basis exceptional. And I think that idea is one that we come back to in order to defend our profession on like periodically, and is sometimes successful-ish, oftentimes when it aligns with the university's kind of self-promotional desires. But the ideology that produces it and reproduces it, I don't know if it's doing us any good. I think that it effectively puts the way that our profession is structured to think about ourselves and produce the narratives about ourselves. Like when you think about going up for promotion, the stories that we tell about ourselves, in the way that reproduce that kind of exceptionalism on an everyday basis, and I think can provide a really messy foundation for connecting with other people who are doing other things that we call labor. And so I think that like recognizing that the academic exceptionalist narrative is a survival strategy for many of us, but also that the like 3/4 of academic labor is casualized at this point. It's really not working for most of us, and as a result, I think it's like the calling of academic work labor is a strategy that I think can provide different kinds of connections in the longer run in terms of organizing. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Wow, that really resonates with me, and just some of the challenges that our chapter has experienced in terms of organizing full-time faculty labor, because that exceptionalist narrative is alive and well here. And John Dewey was one of the founders of our university.
That's right.
So, Nick, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So our last question will be from Cole.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. I've been following your work for quite a while, and so this is always somewhat revelatory.
Thank you.
I actually had a question that relates to both the first question and then I also think to Kaya's question. I'm in a like a credentializing master's program to get a special education teaching certificate. And one of the things that I've been struggling with in thinking through the structures that you're kind of articulating for the function of the university is like where credentializing professional degree programs and the students who are in them fit into the larger apparatus. And particularly in the ways that, like, you know, oftentimes the people who come out of them are the most debt burdened with the least
yes,
like place of recourse, and also are predominantly women of color, particularly like Black Latino women. And so in moving into caring professions that are chronically underpaid depending on the state and area. And so I was just wondering, like, I've struggled quite a bit with like how to think through these programs, which are like cash cow programs often, but are social necessities, but built off of the labor and the like the debt burden that's placed onto like a largely feminized, like largely racialized like cohort. And I've been struggling both to understand like the function beyond the simple like profit orientation of it, and both the function within the system that exists and also the potentialities that could exist for those people and those students / professionals, future professionals, to like impact the type of organizing that happens in universities, especially like larger public or commuter school universities. And so I was just wondering if you had like thoughts on the role of people like the people that I go to school with, and like what they're doing now and what we could be doing to like participate in some of these actions and this work.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and it also sounds like you've done a lot of thinking through it very well. I don't have a ton to say other than, especially with the credentializing programs, the fact that they are producing something that is intentionally made scarce in order to produce people who are charged with the well-being of others, and therefore charged with actually creating life and sustaining life. The fact that people are going into often 6 figures of debt just to go through them, and going through them in such a way that it's very difficult to create solidarity because you're not going to be there that long. There's not this idea like credentializing programs, like with the exception of, let's say, like some of the teacher credentializing programs, but like the idea of getting lost in the life of the mind, like there being this kind of secondary grounding mechanism that is less about the attainment of the credential, they don't really exist through those functions. And so it's really difficult. I think I'm thinking about nursing here. Like, I do think that one of the places to go, because those credentializing programs actually often produce people who go into very, very, very radical unions. And I'm thinking like, you know, the some of the most reliably left unions being the nurses union. So I think that there are already existing organizing structures feeding back into that direction. And I think actually having some kind of larger conversation about organizing alongside other people in universities to create those kind of links, I think it'd be really, really like fascinating, especially in the context of healthcare, because universities, like in many places, University of Pittsburgh, San Francisco, universities basically have this incredibly large footprint in cities because of the way that they are organized. They organize through healthcare on a nonprofit basis. So I don't think that's a panacea for every profession, but I do think that there are already existing professional structures that can be really exciting sites for university organizing as well.
I mean, that's an amazing response. And it really, I think, is of a piece of what you were communicating to us, thinking about the university as part of this just much larger fabric of labor. You know, here at the New School right now, we're in this moment where something that's being pushed is like executive education, and therefore students coming in who are non-degree seeking students who therefore won't be here very long. And then it's hard to know who's even teaching those courses. So how do you build solidarity with them? So it poses intense organizing challenges. Well, Nick, thank you so much. David.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Wow, this was just incredible. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that we learned so much, and there's just so much to build from here. Thank you. And I cannot wait for these books. It's 2 books, right?
Yeah, 2 books.
Yes, I cannot wait.
Thank you so much. And I'm excited to continue to be in conversation with you all. This is actually like the first time like thinking in public through the stuff that I was talking with you about, particularly the GI Bill stuff. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation.
Yeah, such amazing. Thank you so much.
That's so great. The GI Bill stuff is like, it's brilliant, but also like just needs to be out there in the world. Like, what a amazing like kind of turn of the wheel. Like you're like, no, not that. Actually, this really nefarious. Yeah. Sorry, David, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm really grateful for this talk. This was an amazing conversation and introduced me to some new concepts that I am really excited to deep dive into as I learn more about austerity and what that means as a New School student. So thank you for this.
Thank you. And yeah, if stuff comes up, let me know. I love talking with people who are thinking through these problems.
Nick, we would love to have you back at the New School and in the chapter. Come back anytime to you know, think through any of your ideas with us. We are ready and willing.
Awesome. Thank you. I will.